That said, we do know that gold has dropped over the last 2 years, and I explained that. And the thing is, in the meantime, the Chinese have built their infrastructure. You know, they've built many cities. They're the kind of world leaders in magnetic levitation, high-speed railroads. They have, you know, superb airports, and yeah, they're in trouble. There's no question about that. I mean, they even talked about having a quantitative easing, which is just another word for unlimited money printing. You know, because they can print their yuan too, and the value of the yuan has declined over the last few months. And he goes on to say here, there's been a lot of evidence put together that has very well, shall we say, documented that for every ounce of gold in existence, there are 100 claims for every ounce of gold. Think about that. So the question now is, how much, how big, and how quickly does this scandal in China become uncovered? Make no mistake, there will be executions in China over this, because unlike the causinization refers to that crooked gentleman known as Causing, who was in charge of MF Global, that robbed literally hundreds of millions of ounces from their customers, and he never went to jail. He was never prosecuted, none of that. One of the biggest contributors to Obama's campaign fund. Even though we Americans have become almost completely numb with scandal after scandal, well, that's true. You know, just one after another. And it's all covered up, papered over, as if there was nothing wrong. This one has the potential to shake the entire globe so that we cannot ignore it. So that's what I'm talking about, in your face. This is all about the credit structure coming down. Collateral has been lent against many times over, in some cases never even existed, or has been stolen. This is about trust, and will quickly become about liquidity and the lack of it. This is initially a highly deflationary event, as almost everything is run on credit, that is debt. Everybody and everywhere will feel the shockwaves. All right, so those who do not, that is, have gold and silver in their own possession, will need to spend much more of their fiat dollars, the Federal Reserve note, to secure gold and live in hyperinflation. This is the perfect storm for America and the greatest setup of all time for a revaluation of gold and silver. The dollar will be sold like a hot potato. At the same time, revelations of lost and otherwise stolen gold come out in public. Picking a higher number for gold correctly will be a crapshoot and could even become an infinite number under the worst circumstances. Okay, so that is a synopsis of what's happening right now, and bears you keeping an eye on it. Go to Zero Hedge. They're on top of this story, and also is zerohedge.com, and harveyorgan.blogspot.com. And if you haven't subscribed to Jim Willie, it's around $18 a month. But you pay for 6 months at a time, and there's no better source of information in existence of what's happening behind the scenes everywhere in the world. And the thing is with Americans is they have a singular serious illness. And this illness is called ethnocentrism. They don't believe anything happening outside their backyard is of any importance whatsoever. Well, that is not the case. Now, threefold Commonwealth. I have in my possession here the time sequence and spiritual foundation of threefolding. These were 2 lectures that only surfaced. They were given in 1919 in Dornach, Switzerland, March the 23rd and 29th, and they only surfaced in English in 1998. And I only came into possession by, shall we say, by what you might call serendipity. And because, and I haven't mentioned this, but I kind of, I need to read these things several times in order for me to really grasp them in their full implications and profundity of or the profundity and the tenor of thought that goes into everything that Steiner has put into everything that he's done over the course of his life. And the interesting question is, we are now in the 5th post-Atlantean culture, which is called the Anglo-Germanic. And it began in 1413 AD, and it is going to finish 2,160 years later. Then we move into the 6th post-Atlantean culture, which is the Slavic. And then we move into the 7th post-Atlantean culture, which is variously given the names of American or Scandinavian. I've seen both applied. And he basically says, and I will be going into these 2 talks in more detail next time, that there's the threefolding signifies what it means is that the social organism in which we live will be split into 3 independently administered areas of influence, which will be totally independent of one another, and yet they will cooperate. And the one of them is the cultural sphere, which includes education and spiritual life and the judiciary and art, science, education in the broadest possible sense of the word. as well as a free and independent spiritual life. And it has its own administration, and it has its own set of regulations, and it operates independently. However, that aspect of the threefold social organism has to be supported because it's non-productive in terms of money making, making a living. It can only be supported by the economic sphere. So the economic sphere, which is business and agriculture, has to be set up and administrated and regulated with its own regulatory bodies and administrative institutions, and it's run independently. And then the third aspect is the life of rights and justice, which is, properly speaking, what government is concerned with only. Is not concerned either with the educational system or the life of our spiritual religious practices, if we have them, or our artistic endeavors in terms of poetry and prose and art, painting, music, architecture, so forth. And the judiciary. The judiciary cannot be politically appointed. No. So the governmental aspect, the life of rights and justice, it has its own administration, and it has its own regulatory bodies that serve to regulate it, and these three operated independently of one another. And the economic sphere, which is fundamentally to do with the production, distribution, and consumption of commodities. That's it. And that is a very simplified version. Now, in terms of the time factor, those will come about in sequence, according to what he says here, that the cultural sphere has to be implemented by the end of the fifth post-Atlantean culture. So whatever 2160 plus 1413 is, what's that? 2160, 14, that's 35, right? 2160. So 2100 plus 1400 is 35. So 3573 AD will be, by that time, the cultural sphere, which will need to have been set up as an independent body with its own regulators, its own regulations, independent of the government. This is very important. Now, do we see any evidence of this already happening? Well, we do. There's a lot of independent schools.